England, 1786. Move them. The prisons are full. For decades, Britain had been shipping its criminals to America. Then America won its independence, and that door slammed shut. So, in 1787, they loaded 11 ships with 775 convicts and sent them to the other side of the world. 8 months at sea, 15,000 miles, 48 people died on the way. When they finally arrived, there were no European roads, no European buildings, nothing they would have recognized as a town. Just the local Eora people and an untouched harbour. This is what they built here. Using historical maps, paintings, and written records, we used AI image tools to reconstruct what early Sydney may have looked like. This is Sydney, January 26, 1788. The ships have just anchored in Port Jackson. No one on board has ever seen this place before. The harbour is vast. Deep water, wooded shores, complete silence, broken only by the sound of their own vessels. Their commander, Arthur Phillip, called it the finest natural harbour in the world. Looking at it now, it is hard to argue. 3 months after landing, a convict named Francis Folkes drew the first ever map of Sydney Cove. He had been sentenced to 7 years transportation for stealing a coat and a pair of boots. His map shows the 11 ships still anchored in the harbour, a few dirt tracks, tents for the men, tents for the women, saw pits, storehouses, and a blacksmith. While George Washington was being inaugurated as America's first president, and Paris was only days away from the storming of the Bastille, this was Sydney. That was the entire city. 6 years after landing, Thomas Watling, another convict transported for forging banknotes in Scotland, painted this view of Sydney Cove directly from nature. The tents are gone. Brick buildings now line the waterfront. Ships crowd the harbour. A town is beginning to take shape. Watling himself was not impressed. He wrote home complaining that the colony was barely a third the size of his hometown of Dumfries. He was not wrong, but it was growing. This was the seat of power, the first government house. Brick walls, a timber fence, 2 small sentry boxes at the gate. From here, Arthur Phillip governed a colony of more than 1,000 people, the vast majority of them convicts. Men and women who had stolen coats, boots, bread, guarded by around 200 soldiers who were barely better off than the people they were watching. Not quite what a government house is supposed to look like, but it held the whole thing together. By 1797, the colony had a problem. They were growing grain, but had no efficient way to mill it. So they built this, Sydney's first windmill, on the highest hill above the settlement, the hill they simply called Windmill Hill. Governor Hunter had the parts shipped from England. A convict named John Davis built it. It could grind a bushel of wheat in 10 minutes. Below the hill, the rocks, was the convict side of town. People lived in small stone and timber houses, kept chickens and pigs, and grew vegetables in fenced gardens. After their government work ended in the afternoon, they were largely free, running private trades from home, baking bread, forging tools, opening pubs. Less a prison, more a rough working village clinging to the sandstone. The windmill lasted only 3 years before falling into disrepair. But the hill kept its name, and today it is where the Sydney Observatory stands. By the end of the 1790s, Sydney was no longer just a cove. Convicts who had served their time were being granted small plots of land, 30 acres, a few tools, some basic supplies, and sent to farm inland around Parramatta. Roads were being hacked through the bush. The Hawkesbury River region was already being farmed before the road to reach it was even finished. Sydney Cove remained the port where ships arrived, goods moved, and news from the outside world finally landed. But the colony's centre of gravity was already shifting west. 11 years after the First Fleet had anchored here with no plan and no food, there were now farms, roads, a second town, and a population pushing 5,000. It was not England, but it was starting to look like something permanent. 15 years after the First Fleet, this is what they had built. Sandstone houses climbing the hillside, fenced gardens, a working wharf, ships from 3 continents anchored in the same harbour where there had once been nothing but bush. The population had reached around 7,000. Trading ships were arriving regularly. The colony was no longer waiting for supply ships to survive. It was beginning to trade on its own terms. Convicts were still arriving, but so were free settlers, merchants, and sailors who never left. Sydney was becoming a place people chose, not just a place they were sent. They had been sent here as punishment. Now, some of them owned the place. We saw this building before, a modest brick structure with a timber fence and 2 sentry boxes. That was 1791. By 1807, it had grown. A long drawing room had been added. A veranda now ran across the full frontage. Still not grand by any European standard. Every governor who lived here complained that it was damp, too small, and falling apart. But it held the entire colony together for 56 years. Australia's first newspaper was printed here. The first laws were issued from here. 9 governors lived and ruled from this address. The man who painted it, John Eyre, had arrived in Sydney as a convict, transported for housebreaking. By 1807, he had earned his pardon and was painting the very building that had once held his fate. 1 year after this painting was made, soldiers would march through that gate, walk upstairs, and arrest the governor in his bedroom. All because of rum. January 26, 1808. Exactly 20 years to the day since the First Fleet anchored here. 400 soldiers marched down Bridge Street, band playing, flags flying, bayonets out. The governor's daughter tried to stop them at the gate with a parasol. They found Governor Bligh hiding behind a bed. Australia's first and only military coup, driven by a power struggle over who controlled the rum trade. History would call it the Rum Rebellion. The colony had been running for 20 years and had already overthrown its own government. The colony needed a hospital. The British government refused to pay for it, so Governor Macquarie made a deal. 3 merchants would build it in exchange for a monopoly on importing 45,000 gallons of rum into the colony. No money changed hands. The hospital was paid for entirely in alcohol. That is why they called it the Rum Hospital. Construction began in 1811. It took 5 years, mostly because the builders cut so many corners that parts of it were nearly collapsing before it even opened. One of the 3 merchants who built it was also the colony's chief surgeon. The man responsible for treating the sick was also profiting from the rum trade. The north wing of that building still stands today as New South Wales Parliament House. These cannons in the foreground came from the Sirius, one of the original 11 ships of the First Fleet, wrecked off Norfolk Island in 1790, later salvaged and mounted here at Dawes Point to defend the harbour. Below them, the government dockyard. Behind that, the town climbing the sandstone hills. 30 years of building, all visible from this single point. The two well-dressed figures on the right are not convicts. They are colonists, people who chose to be here or were born here. A new kind of Sydney resident. The exact spot where these cannons once stood is now one of the pylons of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. While Bolivar was liberating South America and Napoleon was wasting away on a rock in the South Atlantic, this was Sydney. A working harbour, a few hundred buildings, Aboriginal Australians watching a town that had replaced their world in 30 years. Empires were falling. Sydney was still waiting for its first proper church. Here it is, Sydney's proper church. The first one had been made of mud and sticks, built in 1793 by convict labour. The convicts burned it down 5 years later. This replacement was stone, with a 150-foot round tower bolted onto the front. It looked wrong. Everyone agreed. They called it the ugliest church in Christendom, built from cheap materials by people who had never built a church before. And it showed. From this hill, you can see the whole colony in a single glance. Where the streets stop, the bush begins. No gradual fade, just an edge. On one side, a British town, the only significant European settlement on a continent the size of Europe. On the other side, everything else. Land that had been home to Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years, and still was. By 1819, the Eora people were moving between both worlds, fishing in the harbour, trading on the edges of town, some living just beyond that line. But their numbers had already been cut in half by smallpox in the colony's first year. They were still here, just far fewer of them. Every building you have seen in this story was built by these men. By 1821, convicts and former convicts made up roughly 2/3 of the entire colony. They quarried the stone, laid the roads, built the churches, the barracks, the hospital. From dawn to dusk, watched by armed overseers. Flogging was standard punishment for going too slowly. But it was never a simple story. Some were assigned to private settlers. Conditions varied wildly depending on who owned your labor. A lucky few, like Francis Greenway, used their skills to carve out real lives. Most did not. The men in this painting are breaking stone. Some are serving 7 years for stealing bread. Some will never go home. And this is where they slept. Before this building opened in 1819, convicts were scattered across Sydney, renting rooms, sleeping rough, disappearing into the town at night. The government had no idea where half of them were. Macquarie's solution was to put them all in one place. 600 men sleeping in hammocks stacked 3 high, locked in at night, marched out to work in the morning. Francis Greenway designed it, a convict building a prison for convicts. He did such a good job that Macquarie gave him his freedom. The building still stands today. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Remember the ugliest church in Christendom? This is what Sydney looked like when it actually tried. St. James, completed in 1824. Sandstone, Georgian, elegant. The kind of building that said the colony was no longer embarrassed about itself. Hyde Park in front of it, gas lamps going in, proper streets, carriages. Sydney had stopped looking like a camp and started looking like a city. St James still stands today, the oldest church in Sydney, still holding services every Sunday. This is the view that tells you Sydney has entered a new phase. Government House on the left, Fort Macquarie on the point, ships from 4 continents in the harbour, well-dressed colonists taking an afternoon stroll. 5 years earlier, transportation to New South Wales had ended. No more convict ships. Sydney had just been declared a city, its population pushing 35,000. The convicts already here were still serving their sentences. The last of them would not be fully free until the 1850s. But no new ones were coming. The people walking in this painting either chose to be here or were born here. The penal colony was gone. What replaced it looked like this. 2 forts, 1 harbour entrance, Dawes Battery on the left, where this whole story began. The cannons from the Sirius, the First Fleet, now part of a proper fortification. Fort Macquarie on the right, built on Bennelong Point in 1817. For 60 years, this harbour had been defended by whatever they could scrape together. By 1840, it finally looked like they meant it. The point where Fort Macquarie stands will be demolished in 1901. Eventually, they will build something else there, something you might recognise. Every person in this story arrived by sea. Every letter, every law, every order from London came through this water. This ship is sailing toward Government House on the hill, flying the Union Jack. To anyone arriving for the first time, that building said one thing clearly. You are still in the British Empire, just very far from it. The old Government House, the damp, cramped building that 9 governors had complained about for half a century, was finally demolished in 1846. This is what replaced it. Gothic Revival battlements, towers, a building designed to look like a small English castle dropped into the Australian bush. It looked like England. That was entirely the point. Across the world, colonies were breaking free. Latin America had thrown out the Spanish. Europe was erupting in revolution. The United States had been independent for 60 years. Sydney still flew the Union Jack and did not seem to mind. A colony built on punishment finally had a proper court of law. The Supreme Court opened in 1827, next door to St James's Church, on a square Macquarie had planned as the civic heart of the city. The courthouse had originally been designed as a school. Someone in London decided a court was more important. In front of it, Hyde Park, dedicated as public green space in 1810, the oldest public parkland in Australia. Convicts had raced horses on it before it became respectable. 30 years earlier, justice in Sydney had meant a military officer and a flogging post. Now it had sandstone columns and a Chief Justice. Both buildings still stand today. This is George Street, Sydney's main street since 1788. The same road that began as a dirt track between the first tents. By 1842, it had shops, hotels, offices, horse-drawn carts, and people with somewhere to be. The year this was painted, Sydney was officially declared a city. It still did not have reliable sewers or gas lighting much beyond the centre. A city in name, still catching up in practice. From Flagstaff Hill, you could see everything. The working waterfront below, the harbour beyond, the blue mountains on the horizon 60 kilometres away. Millers Point was the rough end of Sydney. Wharves, warehouses, sailors, labourers. The harbour that had kept the colony alive for 50 years was still its beating heart. Wool going out, immigrants coming in, ships from London, Calcutta, Canton, Cape Town, the windmill still turning, goats still grazing on the hill. For all the civic grandeur of George Street and Queen's Square, this is what actually kept Sydney running. A working harbour town that had learned to call itself a city. Same neighbourhood, now at street level. The Whalers Arms, the hero of Waterloo. Two pubs visible from the same spot. This was Miller's Point, where the ships docked and the sailors spent their money. The hero of Waterloo is still there today, one of the oldest pubs in Australia, built from convict-cut sandstone in 1843. It allegedly had a trapdoor behind the bar. Drunk sailors would vanish through it and wake up on a ship halfway to China. Sydney had its grand buildings. It also had this. This is the tank stream, the reason Sydney exists. Arthur Phillip chose this exact spot in 1788 because of this freshwater creek. It supplied the entire colony for its first decades. By 1852, it was a drain choked with waste, too polluted to use, running between the back walls of buildings that had grown up around it. The city had long since found other water sources and forgotten about this one. The women washing clothes on its banks probably did not know they were standing beside the original reason the entire city had been founded. This is the road west, from Sydney to Parramatta, the colony's second town, 25 kilometres inland. The toll gate meant the colony had grown enough to need roads, and roads cost money. You paid to use them. The round booth on the left is the tollkeeper's hut. Someone sat in there all day collecting coins from passing carts. In 1788, there was nothing beyond this point but bush. By the 1850s, it was a road with a gate and a man taking your money. That is progress. 4 years after gold was discovered near Bathurst, this is what it did to Sydney. The population had doubled. Ships were arriving daily. People were pouring in from Britain, America, China. George Street had gone from colonial town centre to the main street of a boomtown almost overnight. The tents of 1788, the dirt track of the early years, the modest colonial street of 1842, and now this. 67 years. That is all it took. And the gold rush was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. 100 years after the first fleet, this is what a camp of tents had become. 400,000 people. Steamships and sailing ships packed 30 deep in the harbour. Factories, railways, cathedrals. A city stretching farther than the eye can follow. The town hall clock tower in the centre, St. Mary's Cathedral rising on the right, still under construction, still unfinished. Sydney was always building. 30 years earlier, it had been a colonial town. The gold rush changed everything. Money, people, ambition. And it never stopped. 100 years of this, from 11 ships and a prayer to this. Sydney wanted to show the world what it had become. So it built this. The Garden Palace, modelled on London's Crystal Palace, built in just 8 months. A dome 65 metres high, 14,000 exhibits from 34 countries. More than 1 million visitors in 7 months, in a colony of only 700,000 people. Then, at 5:40 in the morning on September 22nd, 1882, fire. The entire building was gone in 40 minutes. government archives, museum collections, census records, all ash. Eyewitnesses said the statue of Queen Victoria was the last thing standing, surrounded by flames on all sides until that too fell. The cause was never found. January 1st, 1901. Sydney Town Hall lit up for the birth of a nation. 6 British colonies had agreed to become one, the Commonwealth of Australia. Still under the Crown, still a dominion, but with its own parliament, its own prime minister, its own flag. 113 years after 11 ships had dropped anchor in an unfamiliar harbour, the continent had a country. Not a revolution, not a war of independence, just a vote, a ceremony, and a lot of lights. That, in its own way, was the Australian way.